Our opening words, I have two short ones. The first one is by Jennifer Michael Height. And as I read this, if you don't like blueberries, please feel free to substitute your favorite natural food. We could stop being lost if we were to just stop trying to get out of the forest. Instead, we could pick some blueberries, sit beneath a tree, and start describing how the sun-dappled forest floor shimmers in the breeze. The initial horror of being lost utterly disappears when you come to believe fully that there is no town out there beyond the forest to which we are headed. If there is no release, no going home, then this must be home. This shimmering instant replete with blueberries. The second reading is by Epicurus. Of all the means which are procured by wisdom. By all the means which are procured by wisdom. Why they talk like that before, I don't know. But anyway, of all the means that are procured by wisdom to ensure happiness throughout the whole of life, by far the most important is friendship. And now I am very pleased to introduce our speaker this morning, someone we all know and love. Betty Mills is a charter member of this fellowship. Folks, she started this place. This place we have to inspire and to soothe our lives. She nurtured and cared for this fellowship, and we love to hear her on mornings like today. She has served on the district UU board and on the national UUA board and is the co-author of Mind If I Differ. Betty Mills.
I have two readings this morning. The first one is is called A Guest of the World, and it's by Jeffrey Lockwood. We are kites, buffeted by the vicissitudes of the spirit, the squalls of fortune, the breezes of intuition, and the glorious gusts of chance encounters. And we are stabilized by a tail, the solidity of the mind, the bedrock of reason, the granite of science. If our tail is too heavy, we never leave the ground. If it is too light, we spin crazily. The people in our lives, families, lovers, friends, community, are the braided strands, a kite string that sustains the dynamic tension between heaven and earth. They are a lifeline that allows us to be uplifted, to live, to see further, to live more fully. And the higher we fly, the stronger our string must be. For when our connection becomes worn and frayed, it can snap. And we will come tumbling back to earth, landing far from where we were left with nobody to repair breaks or mend our tears. And so, rejoice in the wind, but attend to your string. This is called A Ritual to be Read to Each Other, and it's written by William Stafford. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there's many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park, I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life gets lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. For openers, I would like to issue a pass to anyone who finds themselves thinking, I've heard that story before. I pointed this out to Don Morrison when he asked me to do the service to talk about my religious journey. I've given a lot of Sunday morning services and sermons in the 64 years I've been involved in this church. I protested that I might not come up with anything new, but Don, he usually has an answer to all objections, said, but there are a lot of new people in the church who haven't heard them. So here I am in danger of being classed as a garrulous old woman keep telling those same old stories, and it's all Don's fault. The widow of one of my high school classmates sent me a really lovely ceramic plate featuring the Congregational Church, which was technically my religious home for the first 21 years of my life. As I grew older, I used to play the piano for church when needed, and even halfway mastered an ancient pulp organ which required you do the 300-yard dash with your feet while displaying a serene and religious face above the sheet music. We lived 6 miles from Glenallen, and every Saturday morning, if the roads were reasonable and our ancient car was not spread out in pieces on the garage floor, my mother fed us a good breakfast, supervised that we were properly dressed, and at least for me, twisted a nickel in the corner of my compulsory handkerchief for the collection plate, and my father drove us to town for Sunday school. My mother, so damaged by the death of her parents when she was 12 and the attitudes and preaching of her pietistic Norwegian Lutheran church, never attended church. She stayed home and made Sunday dinner and a special dessert, which I thought perfectly acceptable behavior on her part. My father, meanwhile, brought the Chicago Sunday Tribune and read the paper while waiting for us to get out of Sunday school. In the world of my childhood, that also seemed perfectly normal. While in Sunday school, I engaged in a pretty variegated curriculum. The names of Joseph's brothers, the values of the variety of Bible verses, the Christmas story and the Easter saga, plus an early understanding that there was an unspoken limit on the sort of questions it was all right to ask out loud during class. At the time, it wasn't a big deal for me because I could ask my father the questions that I stuffed during class, and he never minded answering. A word about my father. His dad was an immigrant from Sweden. He was a Swedish Baptist, but there was no such church anywhere near Glenallen. So he read the Bible to his children and presumably taught them Baptist gospel, but my father never talked about that aspect of his life. I do know that one of his older sisters was considered the family imp, a reputation she maintained until the day she died. And she used to see that she sat right behind her father's elbow while he read the Bible verses. And the rule was if you laughed or in any way weren't silent and reverent, you didn't get breakfast. Well, she made faces and carried on, and a lot of her sisters and brothers went breakfastless. I had a very elderly Swedish bachelor rancher uncle. He really was a Swedish bachelor uncle who could quote as prodigiously from the Bible as my father could repeat Emerson. And he stayed with us one winter when he was recovering from surgery. Now, Uncle Otto was a timid, bashful man. My father claimed he never had a decent team of horses because he was too gentle to discipline their behavior. To please him that year he stayed with us, I read the entire Bible at his request, including every single begat. Given Uncle Otto's reputation in the family as the authority on the Bible, at one point I asked him, "Do you really believe anyone lived to be 900 years old?" The fury of his response astonished me. He backed me against the living room wall, and he screamed in my face that I would believe every single word in the Bible was true, or I would burn in everlasting hell. That was followed by several variations on the theme, especially about what hell was going to be like. What did I learn? Another person in my life was not interested in answering religious questions. One other aspect of my childhood is relevant to my religious journey. My brother and I were the only Protestants in the one-room country school which constituted the first 8 years of our education. And the school bully regularly led a chorus that it didn't matter what we did. We were going to burn in the fiery furnaces of hell because we weren't Catholic. Some days he illustrated the premise by enforcing a new rule. Only Catholics can play today. You have to sit on the steps. Of course, I turned to the ultimate authority on such a question, my father. Children do not always come at what they want to know directly. They don't come up with the exact question. So I didn't ask him if I was going to burn in hell. I asked him if he believed in hell. He replied that he did not, but he always tried to live so in case there was one, he wasn't in any trouble. One other incident stuck in my young child's head. I'd stayed overnight with an aunt and uncle, and instead of taking me to Sunday school, they hung out a while longer, and they took me to church. The minister's sermon was devoted to his theory that in a certain verse in the New Testament of Jesus, if Jesus had used a comma instead of a period, or maybe it was the other way around, the whole world would be different. I was about 8 or 9 years old, but it struck me even then that that was an absolutely ridiculous premise. And in retrospect, it was the beginning of my understanding that just because it was said in church didn't necessarily make it believable. And the Holy Bible, according to my ancient uncle, the Word of God, contained the possibility that even God sometimes used punctuation with potential for challenge. I was reminded of that sermon a couple of years ago when visiting my beloved and devoutly Christian niece in Texas. I always want to go to the Unitarian Fellowship there, but she insists I go to church with her. I sort of think she thinks maybe there'll be a Texas burning bush or something on my way, that I'll suddenly get a secret revelation. But she does not threaten me with hell. This time when we went, in addition to church, to an hour of Bible study, led by a very personable and a very educated man. What took me back to my 8-year-old childhood, however, was that he spent the entire hour expounding how a certain word of the Old Testament predicted the subsequent arrival of Jesus, presumably thousands of years later. One word. Why tell these stories from childhood? Because I am not some isolated case, a peculiar result of the stars of childhood lighting up in a fashion that ultimately produced a Unitarian Universalist, although it did. But what goes on in the back rooms of this church, this one where we are, after we sing the children out with our blessings, is as vital as what happens to the remaining adults out here. And that's my pitch in case any of you are ever asked to teach at the church school. It matters how we teach children about the big issues in life. And it is important that we supply them with an understanding of how others envision the world, and that we always make them feel at home here in this church that their parents have selected for them. That's my plaudit to the Sunday school teachers this morning. When we discovered Unitarian Universalism through the fellowship movement, that's another interesting piece of history we might talk about sometime. It was for me as if we had opened the door into a new world of religious thought. It was okay to discuss issues we felt uncomfortable mentioning in Orthodox circles. It may be an understatement to say that at that time, Unitarianism was not a religion of any familiarity to the Bismarck public. I sometimes think it still isn't. I am reminded of my neighbor who said almost wistfully, to think she's going to hell and she's going to take all those lovely children with her. As I observed earlier, this was an old familiar charge for me. We were fortunate in our early years to be befriended by several of the denomination's best ministers, who also arranged for others to make at least a weekend stopover. It was kind of like serial seminars on Unitarian Universalism with some instant counseling thrown in when we needed it. After about 10 years, I had migrated to teaching the junior high class. We used a curriculum called Church Across the Street, in which we studied the religious philosophy of the various denominations in town. Then we visited a local church service, and then the following Sunday we discussed. what we had learned or not learned. One day, my good coffee clutch neighbor, a devout Catholic, called me up and ordered me to come down the hill. She said that Monsignor Garvin over at the cathedral was teaching a class for non-Catholics who had some particular reason for wanting to know more about Catholicism. She said, "I want to take you over to the church and I'm going to introduce you to Monsignor, and then you can take the class or not. But don't you ever come down this hill again and ask me one more question about the Catholic Church." She did take me, and I actually have to confess to a kind of a cold fear when I went downstairs in this place that I had only really unhappy memories about from childhood and the things that the Catholics I'd known as a kid had told me, and I thought, what am I doing? Anyway, then from Friday until September, I spent every Tuesday evening for a couple of hours discussing Catholicism, reading a pretty stiff-necked catechism, and becoming a friend of the Monsignor. He once wrote me a Christmas card, called me the big one that got away. I also at the same time wrote about the class. In fact, I would come home from class and sometimes stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning so that it would be fresh in my mind. And I talked about what I had learned and about my Unitarian response. Enough lost sleep, so my neighbor said to me one day, "Don't you feel well?" And I said, "Why?" And she said, "You got black circles under your eyes." And I thought, I should tell her I'm writing a book. Oh, yeah. Anyway, it was ultimately published by the Catholic publishing house Sheed and Ward with the title, Mind If I Differ. It changed my life. About that time, I was elected to the Prairie Star District Board and subsequently to the National Board of the Unitarian-Universalist Association. The book was like taking a puppy through the mall. "Oh, you're the one who wrote the book," would be a frequent response to an introduction or if they read my name tag. And I got to skip explaining that back in North Dakota we had supermarkets and libraries, and we traveled by car, not dog sled. But serving on those boards was like a crash course in Unitarian Universalism. The district board included 8 states plus the Western District of Canada. Theoretically, I covered the UU geography from southern Kansas to northern Saskatchewan. In fact, one of the members of the board once said to me, "You know, you're supposed to go to Baffin Island once in a while, too." For someone whose Unitarian education was based in several small fellowships in North Dakota and Minnesota, it was a course in denominational diversity and the heady politics of an eloquent theological argument held under Robert's Rules of Order. I listened to sermons in churches as diverse as First Unitarian in Minneapolis, where the morning I went, the platform was filled with garbage to illustrate the topic of the day about our sacred responsibility for the earth we share. And there was the church at Hartford, Connecticut, where they still routinely say the Lord's Prayer every Sunday morning. And I did say to the lady that was serving coffee, I said, "You know, it's been a long time since I heard the Lord's Prayer in our church." And she said, "Oh, really?" That was a very standard answer. "Oh, really? You don't have dog sleds? You don't, oh, really?" And there was a great diversity of theological, ecological, theoretical thought in between. I learned firsthand about the diversity of belief and practice across the denomination. At a General Assembly, our yearly national meeting, a worship service was held every evening. And one year, a creative minister from Michigan, he conducted a service in the form of the Catholic Mass, except that the words were all from the Unitarian poet E.E. Cummins. And they scattered bright-colored little pieces of construction paper with quotations from Cummins on it, and we were instructed to trade or do what we want on, get ones we really liked. Years later, I found one of them stuck in a suit coat pocket, which I had saved as instructed because I really liked it. I had no idea what it meant when I read it later. The next evening, the worship service was conducted by a Brooklyn church with a black robe choir singing those elegant sacred texts that such choirs often sing, and a minister preaching what I thought, in retrospect, was a rather ordinary sermon. As I was leaving that service, there were several older women behind me who I could hear talking about that ridiculous church service we'd had the night before. That's the E. Cummins service. And then one of them said, now this one, now that's church. Funny, I had been convinced that I had seen the church for me was the E. Cummins Mass, proving only that we are a very diverse group of people, we Unitarian Universalists. The notion of a fellowship such as ours was often a very strange idea to someone who belonged to a church which seated several hundreds, or which had been around since shortly after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and had an enviable roster of members. You can, for example, go downstairs in the Unitarian Church in Quincy, Massachusetts, and bow reverently before the coffins of John and Abigail Adams and John and Quincy and Louisa Adams. And a friend of mine who grew up in that church said, oh yeah, we went down there at Halloween, it was great. Always respectful, these Unitarians. But despite all that coast-to-coast wandering in the Unitarian world, it is this congregation that instantly reminds me of my religious journey and why this is home. During a very painful experience of my life, I sat by the bedside of my kid sister, watching her final moments as she lost her battle with breast cancer at age 53. When it was finally over, after a long night in a Texas hospital, I searched out the nursing station to ask for official recognition of her death. The nurse sat me in a chair and ordered me to stay there. And when she returned, she put her arms around me and she said, now she's with Jesus. Instantly, the image of this church, this room, this pulpit, the wooden doors, the windows framing the North Dakota Capitol building were before me, and I silently cried, I want to go home. Because that's what this fellowship means to me, my religious home. It's where I made my peace with the religious fragments of my childhood and provided a positive one for my own children, where my philosophy of life and the world around me was often challenged, but never threatened, and where it never occurs to me to be anywhere else on Sunday morning. I would like to close with this quotation, to which I can only say amen. Sometimes it is difficult to affirm life, and then I want to go someplace with other people and sing out that I am here in this world. I want to see affirmation acted, danced, painted, hear it played and sung. Sometimes life is hard to affirm, and when the blows of circumstance descend on me, I want to go someplace with other people and be reminded by the arts and acts of a community that affirmation is a fact larger than my private sorrow or trouble, and that I will come here and praise life again, or if not I, then others will. I need to praise the creativity, personal, social, universal, that saves us, praise the knowledge that frees us, praise the love that operates among us, and I need to accept the fact of suffering and death as the price we pay for it all. I need religion to make me rich enough to pay that price and pay it without bitterness. There. And now the closing thought. Hold on to what is good, even if it is a handful of the earth. Hold on to what you believe, even if it's a tree which stands by itself. Hold on to what you must do, even if it is a long way from here. Hold on to my hand, even when I have gone far away from you.